The wolf was going to die if she did not act quickly. Briar dropped to her knees in the snow, her basket of winter herbs forgotten beside her. The creature lay in a heap at the base of an old oak, its massive black body half buried in a drift, its breathing shallow and labored. Blood stained the white ground beneath it, too much blood, spreading in a crimson pool that steamed faintly in the frozen air. She should leave it. That was what any sensible person would do. A wounded predator was the most dangerous kind, and this wolf was larger than any she had ever seen. Its shoulder alone was nearly as broad as her torso, and even unconscious, there was something about it that radiated power, something that made the animal part of her brain scream to run. But Briar had stopped listening to that voice years ago, on the night her entire family had been slaughtered, and she had been left alone in a world that wanted nothing to do with her. She pulled off her gloves and pressed her hands against the wolf's side, feeling for the source of the bleeding. The fur was thick and coarse beneath her fingers, matted with ice and gore. She found the wound quickly, a deep gash across its ribs, the edges ragged as if made by claws rather than a blade. But there was something else too, something that made her frown. A strange discoloration around the wound, the flesh swollen and hot despite the freezing temperature. Poison. Someone had poisoned this wolf and left it to die. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Wolves did not poison each other. That was a human tactic, or worse, the work of someone who wanted to kill without being caught, someone who wanted their victim to suffer. Easy, she murmured, though she doubted the creature could hear her. I am going to help you. Just hold on. Getting the wolf back to her cabin was nearly impossible. It must have weighed 3 times what she did, and dragging it through knee-deep snow took every ounce of strength she possessed. By the time she managed to haul it through her door and onto the pile of furs before her hearth, her arms were shaking and her lungs burned with exertion. But there was no time to rest, not if she wanted to save its life. Briar worked through the night, drawing on every skill her grandmother had taught her before the old woman died. She cleaned the wound and packed it with poultices designed to draw out poison. She forced water mixed with healing herbs down the wolf's throat, stroking its neck until it swallowed reflexively. She kept the fire blazing high, wrapping the massive body in every blanket she owned, fighting the cold that seemed determined to claim her patient. Dawn was breaking through her frost-covered windows when the wolf finally stirred. Its eyes opened slowly, and Briar found herself frozen in place, caught in a gaze that was nothing like any animal she had ever seen. The eyes were silver, pure, molten silver, bright with intelligence and sharp with pain. They fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, studying her as if committing every detail to memory. You are safe, she said softly, the way she might speak to a frightened child. I found you in the snow. You were hurt, poisoned. I have done what I can, but you need to rest. The wolf continued to stare at her. Then, impossibly, it did something that made her heart stop. It dipped its massive head in what could only be a nod of acknowledgement. Briar scrambled backward, her pulse racing. Wolves did not nod. Wolves did not look at you like they understood every word you said. Unless they were not wolves at all. She looked at the creature before her with new eyes, taking in the impossible size, the unusual coloring, the intelligence burning in that silver gaze. She had heard stories of shifters, of course. Everyone had. But she had never seen one, never expected to find one bleeding out in the forest behind her cabin. What are you? She whispered. The wolf's eyes flickered, and for just a moment she thought she saw something like amusement in their depths. Then they closed again, exhaustion dragging the creature back into unconsciousness. Briar sat back on her heels, her mind racing. A shifter. She had saved a shifter. And not just any shifter, judging by the size and power that radiated from even this weakened form. Someone important. Someone dangerous. Someone who had been poisoned and left for dead. She looked at the sleeping wolf, at the rise and fall of its massive chest, at the wound that was already beginning to close faster than any natural injury should. Whatever this creature was, whoever it was, fate had delivered it to her door, and Briar had never been very good at turning away from things that needed saving. She woke to find a man where the wolf had been. Briar jerked upright from the chair where she had dozed off, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pile of furs before the hearth no longer held a massive black wolf. Instead, a man lay there, naked, broad-shouldered, his body a map of muscle and scars that spoke of a life filled with violence. His hair was dark as ink, falling across a face that was harsh and angular, all sharp edges and hard planes. Even unconscious, there was something commanding about him, something that made her feel small in her own home. The wound on his side had shrunk considerably, now just an angry red line across his ribs. Whatever poison had been in his system, her remedies had done their work. But that did not change the fact that there was a strange, naked man lying in front of her fire. Briar grabbed a blanket and approached cautiously, draping it over him while trying not to look too closely at anything she should not. She was backing away when his hand shot out and caught her wrist. She yelped, trying to pull free, but his grip was iron despite his weakened state. His eyes opened, those same silver eyes that had stared at her from the wolf's face, and fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. "Where am I?" His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse. "My cabin." Briar forced herself to stay calm. "In the northern woods, about a day's walk from the nearest village. I found you in the snow. You were dying." His brow furrowed, and she watched him struggle to piece together memories that seemed to be eluding him. "The snow, yes, I remember running and then—" His jaw tightened. "Pain, someone I trusted." "You were poisoned," Briar said. "The wound itself was not fatal, but whatever was on those claws should have killed you within hours. You are lucky I found you when I did." The man released her wrist abruptly, as if only just realizing he had been holding it. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, grimacing at the movement, and looked around her small cabin with eyes that missed nothing. She saw him take in the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the worn furniture, the single door and two small windows. Calculating. Assessing. "You live alone," he said. It was not a question. "I do." "Why?" Briar stiffened. "That is none of your concern. You are the stranger in my home, not the other way around." Something flickered in his silver eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. Most people probably did not talk back to him. Most people probably took one look at that face, that body, that aura of barely leashed power, and fell over themselves to please him. Briar had stopped trying to please people a long time ago. "You are right," he said after a moment. "Forgive me. I am not accustomed to being at a disadvantage." He inclined his head in a gesture that seemed almost formal. "My name is Theron. I owe you my life." "Briar." She folded her arms across her chest. "And you do not owe me anything. I would have done the same for any creature I found bleeding in the snow." "Any creature?" A ghost of a smile crossed his harsh features. "Even a wolf the size of a horse with claws that could tear you apart?" "You were unconscious, and I am not in the habit of leaving things to die just because they might be dangerous." Theron studied her for a long moment, that silver gaze weighing and measuring in a way that made her want to squirm. She held herself still through sheer force of will, refusing to let him see how much his scrutiny unnerved her. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said finally. "I have been called both." Briar moved to the small table where she had prepared another batch of healing tea. "You should drink this. The poison is out of your system, but your body still needs to recover." She brought him the cup and watched him drink it without complaint, his throat working as he swallowed the bitter liquid. When he finished, he set the cup aside and met her eyes again. "I cannot tell you who I am," he said quietly. "Not yet. There are people looking for me, people who want me dead. If they learn I survived, if they discover you helped me, your life will be in danger." "My life is already in danger every winter," Briar replied flatly. "Starvation, cold, illness, I have survived them all. A few assassins would simply be a change of pace." That ghost of a smile returned, slightly wider this time. "You are a strange woman, Briar." "And you are a strange wolf, Theron." She gathered the empty cup and turned away to hide the flush creeping up her cheeks. "Now rest. Your body is healing, but you are in no condition to go anywhere. The storm that blew in last night has buried the passes. You are stuck here until the snow clears, whether you like it or not." She expected him to argue. Instead, when she glanced back, she found him watching her with an expression she could not read. "Thank you," he said softly, "for saving me, for not asking questions I cannot answer, for—" he paused, seeming to search for words, "for treating me like a person instead of a monster." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, piercing through defenses she had built over years of solitude. She turned away quickly, busying herself with tidying herbs that did not need tidying. "Get some sleep, Theron. We can talk more when you are stronger." She heard him settle back onto the furs, heard his breathing slowly even out as exhaustion reclaimed him. And she stood at her work table with her back to him, trying to convince herself that the warmth spreading through her chest was just the heat from the fire. It was going to be a long winter. The days blurred together in a rhythm of snow and silence and careful coexistence. Theron healed faster than any human should have, the wound on his side closing to a thin scar within a week. But the passes remained buried, and the storms kept coming, one after another, piling snow against the cabin walls until Briar had to dig out the door each morning just to fetch more firewood. They were trapped together, two strangers sharing a space barely large enough for one. It should have been unbearable. Instead, Briar found herself adapting to his presence in ways that surprised her. Theron was not an easy man. He was gruff and guarded, prone to long silences and sudden dark moods that made the cabin feel smaller than it was. But he also insisted on making himself useful, chopping wood when she allowed it, and repairing the leak in her roof that she had been ignoring for months. He watched her work with her herbs and asked questions that were surprisingly astute, as if genuinely interested in what she knew. And sometimes, late at night when the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, he would tell her stories. They were strange stories. Tales of a kingdom far to the south where wolves walked as men and men ran as wolves. He spoke of great battles and ancient feuds, of alliances forged and broken, of a throne that had been contested for generations. He never placed himself in these stories, never claimed any connection to the events he described. But she saw the way his silver eyes grew distant when he spoke, the way his hands curled into fists at certain names. These were not legends to him. They were memories. On the 10th night, Briar finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she found him. "Who did this to you?" She was sitting across from him, a cup of tea warming her hands, the fire crackling between them. "You said it was someone you trusted, someone close to you." Theron's expression shuddered. For a long moment she thought he would refuse to answer, the way he had refused so many other questions. Then his shoulders sagged, and he looked suddenly older than his years. "My brother," he said quietly. "Half-brother, to be precise. We share a father but not a mother. He was always jealous of things I had that he wanted. I thought we had moved past it. I thought he had accepted the way things were." His laugh was bitter. "I was a fool." Briar's chest ached with a sympathy she had not expected to feel. He poisoned you and left you to die in the snow. He did. Theron's silver eyes met hers, and the pain in them was raw and unguarded. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there. The whispers, the alliances he was building, the way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching. But I wanted to believe he loved me. I wanted to believe that family meant something. The words hit close to home, stirring memories Briar had tried to bury years ago. Her own family, slaughtered in a raid she barely survived. The guilt of being the only one left alive, the loneliness that had followed her ever since. She understood betrayal, even if hers had come from fate rather than blood. Family should mean something, she said softly, but sometimes the people who are supposed to love us are the ones who hurt us most. Theron studied her face, and she saw the question forming in his eyes. She braced herself for it, the inevitable inquiry into her own past, her own wounds. But instead, he simply nodded. You speak from experience. I do. He did not push. He did not demand her story the way she had demanded his. Instead, he reached across the space between them and laid his hand over hers, his palm rough and warm against her skin. The touch sent a jolt through her, unexpected and electric, and she saw his eyes widen slightly as if he had felt it too. I am sorry, he said, for whatever happened to you, for whatever drove you to this cabin in the middle of nowhere, alone. Briar should have pulled away. She should have retreated behind the walls she had built so carefully over the years. Instead, she turned her hand over and let her fingers intertwine with his. I am not alone right now, she said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was ready to examine. Theron's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a feather-light touch that made her shiver. No, he agreed, his voice rough. Neither am I. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, the fire burning low, the storm raging outside. Something had shifted between them, something fragile and new that Briar was afraid to name. She had spent so long convincing herself that she did not need anyone, that solitude was safety, that letting people close only led to pain. But Theron's hand in hers felt like the first warm day after a long winter. It felt like hope. When she finally rose to bank the fire for the night, he did not let go immediately. His fingers lingered against hers, reluctant to break the connection. Thank you, he said again, and this time the words carried a different weight. For listening, for not judging me. Briar looked down at him, this wounded wolf who had stumbled into her life and somehow made her small cabin feel less empty. Get some sleep, Theron, she said softly. Tomorrow is another day. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to his breathing even out across the room, she knew that something had changed. And she was not sure she could ever change it back. 2 weeks into his recovery, Theron asked her to teach him. Briar looked up from the salve she was grinding, certain she had misheard. Teach you what? Your craft. He gestured at the bundles of dried herbs, the jars of tinctures, the carefully labeled pouches that lined her shelves. I have watched you work for days. You saved my life with nothing but plants and knowledge. I want to understand how. No one had ever asked her that before. The villagers who occasionally sought her out for remedies treated her like something to be tolerated, not learned from. They took what she offered and left as quickly as they could, muttering prayers to ward off the strange woman who lived alone in the woods. It takes years to learn properly, she said cautiously. My grandmother taught me from the time I could walk. Then teach me what you can. Theron moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. We have nothing but time. So she taught him. She showed him how to identify the herbs that grew beneath the snow, the roots that could be dug even in the depths of winter. She explained which plants healed and which ones killed, and how sometimes the difference was only in the dosage. She let him grind the salves and mix the tinctures, correcting his technique with patient hands, trying not to notice how her pulse quickened whenever their fingers brushed. Theron was a surprisingly good student. He listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and remembered everything she told him. More than that, he seemed genuinely fascinated by the work, his silver eyes bright with interest as she explained the properties of each ingredient. It was strange, seeing such a powerful man humble himself to learn from her. Strange and unexpectedly endearing. "You could have been a healer in another life," she told him one afternoon, watching him carefully measure dried willow bark into a poultice. "You have the hands for it." He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "In another life, perhaps. In this one, I was trained for different things." "What things?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Theron's hands stilled on the mortar, and for a moment she thought she had pushed too far. Then he set down the pestle and turned to face her fully. "War," he said quietly. "Politics. Leadership. I was raised to command armies, to navigate alliances, to make decisions that affect thousands of lives." His jaw tightened. "I was raised to be a king." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew. Briar stared at him, her mind racing to catch up with what he was telling her. "A king," she repeated slowly. "The Alpha King, to be precise, of the Southern Territories." Theron's silver eyes held hers, watching for her reaction. "My father died 3 months ago. I was to be crowned before the winter solstice. But my brother had other plans." Briar's legs felt unsteady. She lowered herself onto the stool beside her work table, trying to process the revelation. The Alpha King. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. Rumors of the young ruler who had united the fractured wolf packs, who commanded an army that had never been defeated, who was said to be as ruthless as he was powerful. And he was sitting in her cabin, learning to make salves. "You must think me a fool," Theron said, his voice rough with something that sounded like shame. "A king who let himself be poisoned by his own brother, who nearly died in the snow like a common animal. I think you are a man who wanted to believe the best of someone he loved." Briar met his eyes steadily. "That is not foolishness. That is hope." Theron's expression cracked, the mask of the king giving way to the wounded man beneath. "I should have seen it. I should have—" "Should have what? Lived your life in suspicion, never trusting anyone, always waiting for the knife in your back?" Briar shook her head. "That is not living, Theron. That is just surviving. Sometimes survival is all there is." "I used to believe that." She reached out and laid her hand over his, the same way he had done for her nights ago. "I spent years alone in these woods, telling myself that solitude was safety, that needing no one meant no one could hurt me. But it was not living. It was hiding." Theron turned his hand over, his fingers curling around hers. "What changed?" "You," she admitted, the word barely a whisper. "You stumbled into my life half dead and bleeding, and somehow you made me remember what it felt like to not be alone." The silence stretched between them, charged with everything they were not saying. Theron's thumb traced slow circles on her palm, his silver eyes never leaving her face. "I should leave when the pass is clear," he said finally, though his voice held no conviction. "I should return to my kingdom, reclaim my throne, deal with my brother. That is what a king would do." "And what would a man do?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, soft, reverent, full of meaning. "A man would stay," he murmured against her skin. "A man would want to know what this feeling is and where it might lead. A man would choose the woman who saved his life over the crown that nearly cost him everything." Briar's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. You cannot abandon your kingdom for a healer in the woods. No, Theron agreed, and something in his eyes made her chest ache. But perhaps I could ask her to come with me when I go. The question hung between them, impossible and terrifying, and full of a hope neither of them had expected to find. And for the first time in years, Briar did not immediately say no. The kiss happened 3 days later, on a night when the storm finally broke and the stars emerged for the first time in weeks. Theron had insisted on going outside to check the snow levels, to see if the passes might be clearing. Briar had followed him, wrapped in her heaviest cloak, telling herself it was only to make sure he did not overexert himself. His wound was healed, but she worried anyway. She had grown accustomed to worrying about him. The night was impossibly beautiful. The snow glittered beneath the moonlight like a field of scattered diamonds, and the sky above was a tapestry of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Briar's breath fogged in the frozen air as she stood beside Theron at the edge of the tree line, taking in the silent wonder of it all. I had forgotten, Theron said quietly, his silver eyes reflecting the starlight. How beautiful the world can be when you stop to look at it. You have been too busy being a king to notice stars? I have been too busy surviving to notice anything. He turned to face her, and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. Until you. Briar's heart stuttered. She should say something light, something to break the tension that had been building between them for days. But the words would not come. All she could do was stand there, frozen in place, as Theron stepped closer. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice low and rough. Something I should have said days ago. Theron, let me finish, please. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm against her cold cheeks. When I woke up in your cabin, I thought fate was playing a cruel joke. I had been betrayed, poisoned, left to die, and then I opened my eyes and saw you. This fierce, stubborn woman who had dragged a wolf 3 times her size through the snow just because she could not bear to let something die. Briar's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Anyone would have. No, they would not have. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. Most people would have run. Most people would have left me to the cold and congratulated themselves on their good sense. But you stayed. You fought for me when you did not even know my name. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Do you have any idea what that means to a man who has spent his whole life surrounded by people who only want what he can give them? She could not speak. Her throat was too tight, her heart too full. I am falling in love with you, Briar. The words came out raw and unguarded, stripped of all pretense. I know it is too fast. I know we have only known each other for weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are the first person who has ever seen me. Not the king, not the alpha, just me. And I do not want to go back to a world where I have to pretend that does not matter. A tear slipped down her cheek, caught by his thumb before it could fall. Briar looked up at this man, this king, who had crashed into her life and dismantled every wall she had built, and she knew she was standing at a crossroads. She could retreat into safety, push him away, protect herself from the pain that inevitably came with letting someone close. Or she could be brave. I am terrified, she admitted, her voice shaking. I have been alone for so long. I do not know how to be anything else. Then let me show you. Theron's forehead dropped to rest against hers. We can learn together, one day at a time, one moment at a time. Briar closed her eyes, breathing him in. Pine and snow, and something wild that was uniquely him. Her hands came up to grip the front of his coat, anchoring herself. I do not know how to be a queen, she whispered. I am not asking you to be a queen. I am asking you to be mine. The last of her resistance crumbled. She kissed him. It was clumsy at first, tentative, the kiss of 2 people who had forgotten how to let themselves want. But then Theron made a sound low in his throat, something desperate and relieved and hungry all at once, and his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close until there was no space left between them. The kiss deepened, turned fierce, full of all the longing they had been denying for weeks. Briar's fingers tangled in his hair, his hands spread across her back, pressing her against him like he was afraid she might disappear. The mate bond she had not even known existed flared to life between them, bright and golden and undeniable, flooding her with warmth despite the frozen night. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Theron laughed, a real laugh, surprised and joyful in a way she had never heard from him before. "I was beginning to think you would never do that," he said, his breath warm against her lips. "I was beginning to think the same about you." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise sealed beneath the stars. And when they finally went back inside, hands intertwined and hearts racing, the cabin that had once felt like a prison had become something else entirely. It had become a home. Their home, at least for now, in this stolen pocket of time before the world came rushing back to claim them. The world came back sooner than either of them expected. Briar was outside gathering firewood when she heard the horses. The sound was distant at first, muffled by the snow, but unmistakable. The thunder of hooves and the jangle of tack, growing closer by the second. She dropped the wood and ran for the cabin, her heart hammering with sudden dread. Theron met her at the door, his silver eyes sharp with the same alarm. He had heard it too. "How many?" she asked, breathless. He tilted his head, listening in that way shifters did, processing sounds no human ear could catch. His jaw tightened. "A dozen, maybe more. They are carrying the banner of my brother's house." Fear coiled in Briar's stomach. "They found you." "Someone must have seen me fall, tracked me through the forest before the storms buried my trail." Theron's hands gripped her shoulders, his gaze intense. "Listen to me. When they arrive, you will tell them you found an injured traveler and gave him shelter. You did not know who I was. You had no idea. I am not lying to protect myself while they drag you away to be killed." "Briar dash dash?" "No." She grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him close. "You do not get to do this. You do not get to make me love you and then sacrifice yourself like some noble fool. We face this together or not at all." Something cracked in his expression, grief and gratitude and a fierce, desperate love all tangled together. He pressed his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. And you are an idiot if you think I am letting you go without a fight." The horses burst into the clearing before he could respond. There were 15 of them, armed warriors in black leather armor bearing a crest that made Theron's face go cold. At their head rode a man who shared Theron's dark hair, but none of his warmth. His features were sharper, crueler, twisted into a smile of triumph that made Briar's skin crawl. "Brother." The man swung down from his horse with lazy grace. "I must say, I am impressed. I thought for certain the poison would have finished you by now." "Soren." Theron stepped in front of Briar, shielding her with his body. "You always did underestimate me. And you always did trust, too easily." Soren's pale blue eyes slid to Briar, and something hungry flickered in their depths. "Though I see you have found pleasant company to pass your final days. A healer, by the look of her. How convenient." "Leave her out of this. Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel is with anyone who stands in my way." Soren gestured lazily to his men. "Did you really think I would let you live, Theron? You, with your righteous honor and your tiresome principles? The packs were suffocating under your rule. They need strength, not mercy. They need a king who is not afraid to take what he wants. They need a king who does not murder his own blood for power." Soren laughed, a cold and hollow sound. "Murder is such an ugly word." I prefer to think of it as succession. He drew his sword, the blade glinting in the pale winter light. Enough talk. You have two choices, brother. Surrender now, and I will make your death quick. Or fight, and watch your little healer die screaming before I end you. Briar felt Theron's entire body go rigid. She saw his hands curl into fists, saw the wolf rising behind his eyes, silver bleeding into gold as his control began to slip. He was going to fight. He was going to get himself killed trying to protect her, unless she did something first. Wait! The word came out stronger than she felt. She stepped around Theron despite his growl of protest and faced Soren directly. You want the throne. Killing him gives you that. But killing me gains you nothing, and it will only make him fight harder. Soren raised an eyebrow, looking almost amused. Go on. Let me go. Send me away, banish me, I do not care. But let him watch me leave alive. Her voice did not waver, even though her heart was breaking. He will be easier to control if he knows hurting me is still an option. Briar, no. Theron reached for her, but two of Soren's men seized his arms, holding him back. Soren studied her for a long moment, that cruel smile playing at his lips. Clever little thing, are you not? Using yourself as leverage. He sheathed his sword and stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the copper tang of old blood on his clothes. Very well. I accept your terms. You will leave this place and never return. If you try to contact my brother, if you try to interfere in any way, I will hunt you down and make you watch while I destroy everything you love. Briar, do not do this. Theron's voice was ragged, broken. Please, I cannot lose you. She turned to look at him, memorizing his face, the silver eyes she had fallen into, the harsh features that had softened only for her, the man who had stumbled into her life and made her believe in hope again. You will not lose me, she said softly, lying with every word. This is not goodbye. They dragged her away before he could respond, before she could see the devastation in his eyes. The last thing she heard as they forced her onto a horse was Theron's roar of anguish, echoing through the frozen trees like the howl of a wolf who had lost his mate. And Briar rode into the white wilderness with her heart in pieces and a desperate plan already forming in her mind. They did not take her far. Soren's men escorted her to the edge of the forest, then shoved her off the horse and into a snowdrift. She lay there, gasping, as they laughed and turned back toward the cabin, toward Theron, toward whatever cruelty Soren had planned for his brother now that she was no longer there to protect. But Briar had not survived alone in these woods for years by giving up easily. She waited until the sound of hooves faded into silence. Then she pushed herself up, shaking snow from her hair, and took stock of her situation. They had left her with nothing, no food, no supplies, no weapon. They expected her to wander into the wilderness and die quietly, one more loose end tied up by the cold. They had underestimated her. Briar knew these woods better than anyone alive. She knew where the old hunters' caches were hidden, stocked with dried meat and emergency supplies. She knew which caves offered shelter from the wind, which frozen streams could be crossed safely. And she knew the path to the nearest village, a 2-day walk in good weather, perhaps 3 in the snow. She started walking. The cold bit into her bones, relentless and merciless. Her thin dress was meant for working by the fire, not trekking through winter storms. Within an hour, she had lost feeling in her fingers. Within 2, her lips had turned blue. But she kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant leaving Theron to face his brother alone. She thought of him constantly as she walked, his silver eyes, soft with wonder when he looked at her, his rough hands, gentle when they touched her face, the sound of his laugh, rare and precious, offered only to her. He had given her something she thought she had lost forever, the belief that she could be loved, that she could matter, that she could belong somewhere other than the lonely cabin in the woods. She would not let Soren take that from her. The village appeared on the morning of the third day, just as Briar's strength was finally giving out. She stumbled through the gates, barely conscious, and collapsed in the snow outside the blacksmith's forge. Voices shouted, hands lifted her, and then there was warmth, blessed warmth, and a cup of something hot pressed to her cracked lips. When she finally woke, she was lying in a small bed in an unfamiliar room, bandaged and wrapped in wool blankets. A woman sat beside her, middle-aged, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Easy now." The woman pressed her back when she tried to sit up. "You nearly died out there. Another hour and we would have lost you." "I need—" Briar's voice came out as a croak. "I need to get a message to the capital, to anyone loyal to the true Alpha King." The woman's eyes widened. "The Alpha King? Child, what are you talking about?" "Theron Ashford is alive." Briar gripped the woman's arm with what little strength she had. "His brother tried to kill him. Soren has him prisoner now, probably taking him back to the capital to execute him publicly. But if we can reach people who are still loyal, if we can raise an army before Soren consolidates power—" "Slow down." The woman, a healer, Briar realized, recognizing the herbs hanging from the rafters, studied her with new intensity. "How do you know all this?" "Because I am the one who saved him." Tears slipped down Briar's cheeks, hot against her frozen skin. "He was dying in the snow, and I brought him back. I healed him. Her voice broke. "I love him, and I will not let him die." The healer was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression, not pity, but respect. "My husband was one of the old king's personal guards," she said slowly. "He died in the same raid that killed the queen, years ago. But there are others in this village who remember their oaths, others who never trusted Soren, even before his treachery became clear." Hope sparked in Briar's chest. "Will they help?" "They will need convincing. Proof that Theron still lives, that there is something worth fighting for." The healer leaned closer. "Can you give them that?" Briar thought of Theron's silver eyes, of the mate bond that still pulsed faintly in her chest, despite the miles between them. She thought of every moment they had shared in that cabin, every word of love, every promise. "I can give them more than that," she said. "I can give them their king back." The healer nodded slowly, something like admiration kindling in her gaze. "Then rest now, child. Heal, because tomorrow we have a rebellion to plan." Briar closed her eyes, exhaustion dragging her back toward unconsciousness. But even as darkness claimed her, she felt the mate bond thrumming in her chest, faint but steady, a golden thread connecting her to Theron across the frozen miles. "Hold on," she thought, pushing the words through their bond with everything she had. "I am coming for you." And somewhere in a cold stone cell, chains biting into his wrists and despair gnawing at his heart, Theron lifted his head as warmth flooded through him for the first time in days. She was alive. She was coming. And gods help anyone who stood in her way. The rebellion came together faster than Briar had dared to hope. Word spread through the villages like wildfire. The true Alpha King was alive, held prisoner by his treacherous brother, and a healer from the northern woods was gathering forces to free him. Wolves who had served under Theron's father came out of hiding. Soldiers who had been exiled for questioning Soren's claim sharpened their swords. Common folk who had suffered under the new regime's cruelty offered food, shelter, and information. Within a week, Briar found herself at the head of an army. It was a ragged army, to be sure, farmers and blacksmiths and retired warriors armed with whatever weapons they could find. But their eyes burned with purpose, and when they looked at Briar, they saw something that made her uncomfortable. They saw a leader. "You should not be here," growled Aldrich. the grizzled old soldier who had taken charge of their military strategy. They stood at the edge of the forest overlooking the capital, the massive stone walls of the palace rising against a gray winter sky. "You are no fighter. Let us handle the assault while you wait somewhere safe." "Theron is in there because of me." Briar tightened her grip on the knife at her belt, a poor weapon, but the only one she knew how to use. "I will not hide while others risk their lives to save him." Aldrich studied her for a long moment, then shook his head with something like grudging respect. "The king chose well, it seems. Very well. Stay close to me, and try not to get killed." The attack came at dawn. Soren had grown complacent in his assumed victory, and his guards were unprepared for the fury that descended upon them. Briar's forces poured through the city gates, overwhelming the skeleton crew left to defend them. Fighting erupted in the streets, steel clashing against steel, howls splitting the morning air as wolves shifted and tore into their enemies. Briar ran through the chaos with Aldrich at her side, her heart pounding in her ears. The mate bond pulled her forward like a compass needle pointing north, growing stronger with every step. Theron was close, so close she could almost feel his heartbeat alongside her own. They found the dungeons beneath the palace, guarded by a dozen of Soren's most loyal men. The fighting was brutal and brief, Aldrich and his wolves cutting through the opposition with the efficiency of those who had nothing left to lose. Briar did not watch. She was already running down the stone corridor, following the bond, following her heart. The cell at the end of the hall was locked with iron chains. Through the bars, she could see him, Theron, slumped against the wall, his wrists raw and bleeding from the shackles that bound him. He was thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt and shadowed with bruises. But when he lifted his head and saw her standing there, his silver eyes blazed to life with an emotion that stole her breath. Briar. Her name was a prayer on his cracked lips. "You came." "I told you I would." She was crying, she realized, tears streaming down her face as she worked at the lock with the keys they had taken from the fallen guards. "I told you this was not goodbye." The door swung open. She was in his arms before she could think, pressing herself against him, breathing him in despite the blood and grime that covered them both. His chains clinked as he wrapped his bound arms around her, holding her as tightly as his restraints would allow. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman," he murmured against her hair. "You should have run. You should have saved yourself." "And let Soren win?" She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "Never." A slow clap echoed through the dungeon. They turned to find Soren standing at the entrance to the corridor, a sword in his hand and murder in his pale blue eyes. Behind him, more guards poured in, blocking the only exit. Aldrich and the other rebels were nowhere to be seen, overwhelmed, Briar realized with a sinking heart, or driven back by superior numbers. "How touching." Soren's voice dripped with contempt. "The little healer, come to rescue her king. I must admit I underestimated you. I thought you would die quietly in the snow like a good girl." Briar stepped in front of Theron, putting herself between him and his brother. "Your men are losing. The city is turning against you. It is over, Soren." "Over?" Soren laughed, cold and sharp. "This is far from over. I still have my brother in chains. I still have you." He raised his sword, pointing it at her heart. "And I am going to enjoy making him watch while I—" He never finished the sentence. Theron moved faster than Briar's eyes could follow. One moment he was behind her, weakened and bound. The next, he had snapped the chains like they were made of paper, his body shifting mid-lunge into the massive black wolf she had first found bleeding in the snow. He hit Soren with the force of a battering ram, sending them both crashing to the ground. The fight was savage and brief. Soren was a skilled warrior, but Theron was something more, an alpha in his prime, fueled by weeks of rage and the desperate need to protect his mate. When it was over, Soren lay motionless on the stone floor, and Theron stood over him in human form, breathing hard, blood dripping from his claws. "It is finished," Theron said, his voice hoarse. "You will never hurt anyone again." Briar ran to him, and this time when she threw herself into his arms, there were no chains to hold him back. He caught her and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair, his whole body shaking with relief. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "I thought I would never see you again." "You cannot get rid of me that easily." She pulled back to look at him, cupping his battered face in her hands. "I love you, Theron. I should have said it before. I love you." His silver eyes glistened with tears he did not bother to hide. "I love you too, more than my kingdom, more than my crown, more than my own life." He kissed her there in the dungeon, surrounded by fallen enemies and the echoes of battle, and Briar knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The coronation took place 3 weeks later, on the first day the sun broke through the winter clouds. The great hall of the palace was filled to bursting with wolves from every corner of the kingdom. They had come to witness the crowning of their true Alpha King, the ruler who had survived his brother's treachery and returned from the dead to reclaim his throne. But more than that, they had come to see the woman who had made it possible, the healer from the northern woods, whose name had become legend in the weeks since the rebellion. Briar stood at the edge of the crowd, trying to make herself invisible. She had refused all of Theron's attempts to dress her in silks and jewels, insisting on a simple gown of forest green that reminded her of home. She did not belong here, among the nobles and the warriors and the wolves of high birth. She was just a healer, just a woman who had stumbled into something far bigger than herself. But Theron had other ideas. When the crown was placed upon his head, when the cheers had finally died down, and the hall had fallen silent in anticipation of his first words as king, he did not speak of politics or alliances or the future of the realm. Instead, he stepped down from the dais and walked through the parting crowd until he stood before Briar. "What are you doing?" she whispered, acutely aware of every eye in the hall fixed upon them. "Something I should have done weeks ago." Theron took her hands in his silver eyes soft with love. "Something I would have done in that cabin if fate had not interrupted us." He dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the realm, was kneeling before a common healer in front of his entire court on the day of his coronation. "Briar," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "You found me dying in the snow, and you chose to save me when anyone else would have walked away. You taught me that strength is not just about power, but about compassion. You showed me what it means to be loved for who I am, not what I can offer." His hands tightened around hers. "And then, when my brother took everything from me, you raised an army and brought me back from the darkness. You fought for me when I could not fight for myself." Tears were streaming down Briar's face, but she could not look away from him. "I have spent my whole life preparing to be a king," Theron continued, "but I never learned how to be a man until I met you. You are my heart, Briar, my home, the other half of my soul." He reached into his coat and withdrew a ring, a band of silver set with a stone the color of forest shadows, the same deep green as her eyes. "Will you marry me? Will you be my queen, my mate, my partner in all things? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who saved me?" The hall was utterly silent. Briar could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, could sense the judgment of nobles who thought her beneath their king. But when she looked at Theron, at his silver eyes shining with hope and fear and boundless love, none of it mattered. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, so everyone could hear, "Yes, I will marry you." Theron surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as the hall erupted in cheers. He kissed her deeply, thoroughly, uncaring of propriety or protocol, and Briar laughed against his lips, a sound of pure, unrestrained joy. When he finally set her down, he slid the ring onto her finger and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I told you once that a man would choose the woman who saved his life over the crown. I meant every word. And I told you that you could not abandon your kingdom for a healer in the woods. Briar smiled up at him, her heart so full it ached. It seems we were both right. A compromise, then. His eyes sparkled with warmth. I keep my kingdom and I keep you, the best of both worlds. You are ridiculous. And you love me anyway. She rose on her toes and kissed him again, softer this time, a promise sealed before the watching crowd. I do. More than I ever thought possible. The celebration lasted well into the night, but Briar barely noticed the feasting and dancing and toasts raised in their honor. All she could see was Theron, her Theron, looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She had spent so many years alone, convinced that solitude was the only safety, that love was a vulnerability she could not afford. But Theron had crashed into her life like a wounded wolf in a snowstorm, and he had taught her that the greatest strength was not in standing alone. It was in letting someone stand beside you. And as she looked at the ring on her finger, at the man who would be her husband, at the future stretching out before them full of promise and possibility, Briar finally understood what it meant to come home. 1 year later, they returned to the cabin in the woods. It had been Theron's idea, a private celebration of their anniversary, away from the demands of court and crown. Briar had agreed immediately, her heart aching with longing for the place where everything had begun. The palace was beautiful, and she had grown into her role as queen more gracefully than she ever expected. But some part of her would always belong to those frozen woods, to the small cabin where she had fallen in love with a wounded wolf who turned out to be a king. The snow was falling gently when they arrived, soft white flakes drifting through the bare branches like a blessing. Theron shifted into his wolf form to run the last mile, and Briar rode on his back the way she had done a dozen times since their wedding, her fingers buried in his thick black fur, laughter spilling from her lips. The cabin looked exactly as she had left it. Someone had maintained it in her absence. Theron's doing, she suspected, though he had never admitted it. The herbs still hung from the rafters, the fire pit still sat ready to be lit, and the pile of furs where she had first laid a dying wolf still waited before the cold hearth. I never thanked you properly, Theron said, shifting back to human form as they stepped inside. For that first night, for choosing to save a stranger instead of protecting yourself. You have thanked me every day since. Briar turned to face him, taking in the face she loved. Still harsh, still angular, but softened now by happiness and peace. With your kindness, your patience, your love, I think the debt is more than repaid. It will never be repaid. He pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. Not if I spend 1,000 years trying. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the snow falling silently outside. Then Briar took a deep breath and stepped back, reaching for his hand. I have something to tell you, she said. I was going to wait until we returned to the palace, but this feels right. This is where our story started. It should be where the next chapter begins. Theron's brow furrowed with concern. What is it? Are you unwell? Quite the opposite. She pressed his palm against her stomach, flat beneath her winter dress, but not for much longer. I am carrying your child, Theron. The healers confirmed it last week. The silence that followed was absolute. She watched emotions cascade across his face. Shock, disbelief, and then a joy so profound it brought tears to his silver eyes. He dropped to his knees before her, just as he had done at the coronation, and pressed his forehead against her belly. "A child," he breathed. "Our child. Our child." Briar threaded her fingers through his dark hair, tears slipping down her own cheeks. "A new life, born from everything we built together." Theron looked up at her, his face wet with tears he did not bother to hide. "I do not deserve this happiness. I do not deserve you. You deserve everything." She cupped his face in her hands, the same way she had done on so many nights in this very cabin. "And I am going to spend the rest of our lives proving it to you." He rose and kissed her, slow and deep, a promise renewed in the place where it had first been made. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. And somewhere in the distance, wolves began to howl, a chorus of celebration rising through the winter night. She had found an injured wolf in the snow, not knowing he would change her life forever. Now she was a queen, a wife, a mother-to-be. She was loved beyond measure, cherished beyond words, and home at last. The healer and her wolf, together always, their story written in the stars. And they lived as true mates do, happily ever after.